What do you get when you cross game design with academic research? It sounds like the start of a game studies dad joke, but it's a serious question, not just for Pippin and myself, but also for the field of games research at large. And what is the nature of the cross? Like, are we talking about something like this? Or is it more like addition, game design with academic research tacked on? Or more like division, where we break down game design into academic research-sized chunks? Or is the academic research divided into game design chunks? What if it's game design powered by academic research? Equations of two sides. Maybe we can solve this by thinking about what the output is. But what is the output? So Pippin and I both come from a software engineering and HCI background. Your home discipline ends up casting a long shadow over the types of research you undertake. And of course, disciplinary perspective isn't cut and dried. In any discipline, you'll find different camps of people with different approaches. In their seminal paper, The Three Paradigms of HCI, Harrison et al. Argued that these ideological camps correlated to research waves, or paradigms. The paradigm you align yourself to has a big impact on the epistemologies your research perspectives rest on, the methods you have to hand, and correspondingly, the questions you can ask. It can be difficult to think of, let alone articulate or investigate questions that don't form an easy fit within our accepted epistemological and methodological backdrops. We can find lots of games research that hones in on highly specific aspects of game design, compartmentalizing them and investigating them as experimental variables. For example, the HCI approach to game design, where you find a lot of game design research, typically adheres to this mold. HCI is the curious offspring of computer science and psychology, and started coalescing into a discipline in the 1980s. Information processing, specifically how humans processed information, was a major research focus, with researchers proposing that humans and computers had a lot in common. Fortunately, HCI beliefs have moved on, but the disciplinary preoccupation with usability and controlled experimentation has stuck around. When you look at contemporary HCI research on games, most of it follows these methodological steps: formation of a hypothesis or research question around a game feature or experience variable, running of a practical experiment involving development or modding, deployment and testing with users, usually for the purpose of collecting quantitative data, and reporting general design implications or guidelines. There is the newer community of people who align themselves with games research and game design concerns. The FDG conference brings this community together. When we did an analysis of work published at the 2017 FDG conference that mentions game design as a keyword or term, and this is work we did together with our colleague Jonathan Lissard, we found that 60% of the work mentioning game design was concerned with AI-driven design or machine learning and player metrics. The forms of evidence, proof, and justification often looked like this, and questions surrounding aesthetics were usually secondary to questions regarding AI and automation. Now, if you were to read these papers to understand a design process, you would find detail to be lacking. It's not that people haven't engaged with the process, but they're not writing about it or treating it as a research area. Finally, game design also crops up in game studies, which emerged in the early 2000s mostly in relation to humanities and social science-oriented perspectives. But what is often lacking here is engagement with the materiality of making. Kultima argues that this is because design orientation has not yet become integrated as a game studies perspective. She states that notions of design and design research are not reflected in research papers within the academic field of game research. And due to the absence of the academic counterparts for game design theories, game studies continues to use the early conceptions of the industry-driven game design books. None of these game-focused or game-adjacent academic disciplines currently help us ask all of the design-oriented questions, or give us guidance for how to treat highly contextual accounts of play experience or what to do with intangible and ever-changing aspects like game aesthetics. What we have going on here is another paradigm shift within games research. Outside of academia, the idea that individuals hone knowledge about craft through craft and may use the resulting outputs as material argument is hardly controversial. For instance, a single iteration of GDC results in hundreds of hours of game design experts demonstrating and sharing their knowledge while using designed artifacts or actual games as evidence. In online forums such as Twitter, publications such as RPS and Polygon, and platforms such as itch.io, the design artifact becomes ever more important as material argument. Designers might not be able to have face-to-face conversation with the public, but the public can download and play their games to form their own opinions. In all these contexts that bring communities of game designers together to share and reflect on their craft, the designed artifact is never far from hand. Our goal is to make academic space for game design research that acknowledges the closely knit relationship between making and articulation, the special insights a maker has into their creations, but also the fragility of context. We want something like rigor, otherwise the academic context affords nothing in addition to real-world game design. But is rigor even relevant in the context of design, one in which identical problems can rarely be replicated, designerly intuition is important, and aesthetic taste plays a significant steering role? Instead, we align with the idea of recoverability as a design-friendly alternative to rigor. Other people should be able to recover a design process as opposed to replicate it. So what lies in this space, and what methods should we use in it?
The method for design materialization, or the MDM, is an approach to game design research developed in collaboration between Rilla, Khaled, Jonathan Lessard, and me, Pippin, Barr. The core idea of rigorously documenting the entire process of design and development is something I've been putting into practice since late 2017, covering roughly 20 games. So, without further ado, the key components of the MDM are software engineering. Rilla and I have computer science and software engineering backgrounds, and this leads us to an interest in the nature of video games, specifically as software. In the MDM, we instinctively wanted to maintain this nature as a core concern when documenting and thinking about process. We believe in acknowledging game design and game development as inextricably intertwined. Conversation with materials. Our core philosophical stance on how to think about design draws on Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner. Specifically, we prioritize the idea of game design as an active process of conversation with the materials of creation. In the video game context, that means that source code, sprite atlases, sound files, and beyond are all part of the conversation. So, what is the workflow and outcome of using the MDM in a project? Let's look at my most recent game, Combat at the Movies, as an example. It's a series of adaptations of classic films, such as Citizen Kane, into the interactive and aesthetic language of Atari's game Combat from 1977. The MDM revolves around the use of version control, and in this case I use the software Git along with the online version control management site GitHub. The central concept in version control is the repository, which can most simply be thought of as all the source code and other elements of a project gathered together in one place. The superpower of version control, however, is that you save snapshots of a project throughout its entire history. Each time you make a significant change to any aspect, you commit it to the repository, and that moment becomes part of the history. So here we can see a series of commits from the game's progress, organized in reverse chronological order. Each one represents a moment in time that the project was changed in some way. Importantly, each commit is accompanied by a descriptive commit message. For traditional software engineers, this is usually a short comment about how the code changed, But within the MDM, we use this as an opportunity for immediate reflection on the ongoing design and technical practice. Thus, we expand the idea of a terse commit message to include in-depth, in-the-moment reflection on design, always seeking to tie this specific moment back to the original design and research goals of the project. We call these moments of design commitment. Central to version control is the ability to restore the project to any point in its history by selecting a specific commit and loading its version of the code and assets. This means that we can review the history of a game not just by examining historical changes to the code and to its assets, but also by playing historical versions of the game itself. Because these versions are associated with specific commits, we're then able to pair a designer-developer's reflections about implementation with playable versions of the game from that precise time. Rather than only store code and game assets in the repository, however, we also store process documentation of other kinds. This documentation then becomes another part of the overall history of the project as maintained by Git. Thus, alongside the other elements of the project, we include a process folder that contains specific process documentation formats, as you can see here. The process journal document contains higher-level reflections on the overall design directions and progress of the project. This is nicely complementary to the moment-to-moment reflective commit messages, which tend to deal more in specific technical moments of design as the game is implemented. So process journal reflections most obviously include design reflections, in which the designer contemplates the state of the game's design or proposes design solutions to current problems. And also technical reflections at a higher level in which themes of implementation details and difficulties are expanded and discussed. Because the process journal is inside the repository, it too is associated with a specific commit and thus a specific build of the project. This means it's possible to return to exactly the build of the game that the designer is reflecting on in a process journal entry to get context. A second form used in the MDM is to write research statements that attempt to formulate the research objectives of the project. Acknowledging the iterative nature of design and development, these statements are themselves iterative, written and rewritten as the project progresses. And again, because these statements are inside the repository, they are linked to their specific moment in time and the associated state of the project, including a playable build. Naturally, one of the key objectives of research of this nature is not just to present the final artifact, nor even just the history of design documentation, however valuable those things may be, but also to do some of the work of interpretation, analysis, and presentation of results. Thus, a final part of the MDM is to write what we call a closing statement on concluding a project. This is a piece of writing that draws on the mountain of resources already discussed to draw out conclusions, observations, and insights about the game-making research undertaken. With Combat at the Movies, the closing statement took the form of a published article for the journal Arts, although it might just as easily be an unpublished discussion document included in the repository itself. The key is that these closing statements are able to leverage the evidence present in the repository in order to produce well-argued, grounded discussions of the game-making research in question. And of course, lest we forget, such a closing statement is accompanied by the published build of the game it refers to, along with its entire history as represented by the repository. That's the current state of MDM right now. But as you might imagine, we have many questions and concerns as we seek to advance and improve this particular approach.
How can we make it better?
What about teams?
Non-digital materials?
Is it too disruptive?
What tools are needed for analysis?
Do you want to join in?